Several other of his claims are, extremely important, which is essentially inequality unchecked. It will destroy democracy. And when he was writing, he's saying democracy is kind of a shell of itself. Sure, everybody has the right to vote, but if you have the right to vote and you work 60 hours a week and you can't feed your family, you're not a free born citizen of the American Republic. You're a Russian serf. None of the things that George and Georges want to see happen is going to happen if the political system is, in the hands of, people pulling all the levers in smoke-filled rooms.
My goal is to really kind of get people thinking about American democracy, civic republicanism, that whole sphere of thought that goes at the core of what kind of a lot of founders were trying to get to and things like that. So I just think Henry George is an amazing person. He also seems like the ultimate good guy. Like, he just seems like a good, genuine dude. It's like, wow, it's sometimes shocking to see someone like that be successful. So I guess like kind of my first question, and maybe kind of start it off, is where did you first hear about Henry George, and why did you want to write a book on him specifically?
Well, my name is Edward T. O'Donnell. Everybody knows me as Ed, and my real job is I'm a very, very lucky guy. I'm a tenured college professor at a fine liberal arts institution, Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts, and and I've been there 20 something years. I also was a student there several thousand years ago.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, so it's very kind of a cool thing in that regard. And so I'm American history is my field. Gilded Age, Progressive Era is kind of the 1870, 1920 is the period that I focus on the most. And let's see, so my graduate school work began back in 1988. I moved to New York City with my wife and took up residence at Columbia University. And the first year or so of graduate school is just tons and tons of reading and all that. But at some point, you need to pick your dissertation topic. And I had all kinds of ideas and, 3 or 4 possible 19th century topics. I was always interested in taxes for some strange reason. Like, I wrote my master's thesis. First year of graduate school was on school taxation in New York City. Big controversy about with this emerging thing called public schooling and how are we going to pay for it. And property taxes became at the time, the logical way to do it. Not everybody was excited about that. So that was probably one of the ways in which I got interested in Henry George. But I think one of my professors recommended I read up on him. He said, you should look into Henry George. He's kind of hits several marks, because I was interested in reform, New York, or urban history, immigration, and and I guess on taxes as well. And so he kind of combines all those things. And so anyway, sometime in the early 90s, I committed to writing my dissertation on Henry George and the great labor uprising of the late 19th century. And that began my odyssey. 1995, I graduated from, finished my dissertation, got my Ph.D., got a job at City University in New York at Hunter College, and was there for, I got tenure there. I was there for a while, but then this job that I'm currently in 21 years ago opened up. And, it's just much lower cost of living, a little more space, so Massachusetts was a really good move. Like I said, I'm very lucky. And so that, typically you get your PhD in so in my case, 95, and then you get your job ideally right away, and, your tenure track job. And usually, 3, 4, 5 years into it, that book comes out. That was certainly my plan. I got a contract for it from Columbia University Press, but I will spare you the details. But life is what happens when you're making other plans, kind of a thing. Sometimes good things came along that distracted me from finishing the book. Sometimes, family crises and that sort of thing. So anyway, the book finally came out in 2015. Of course, in a weird way, it's a better book because I'm an older, wiser historian. Also, it's a more relevant book because I don't think anybody in 1995 was saying we are in a second Gilded Age, and invoking all these metaphors and references to the late 19th century and robber barons and also talking about Henry George, as a relevant person in the 21st century. So as I said when the book finally came out, I said I have really good news. Good news for me. Bad news for America is that the Gilded Age is now a hot topic again. It's good news for me because I have a book coming out about Henry George and the Gilded Age. So, yeah,
Yeah.
so that's how that all transpired. So, yeah, I've been living with and thinking about and writing about Henry George for a pretty long time.
Yeah, it is interesting seeing that. Yeah, with the Great Recession or whatever, global financial crisis, it gets all
Mm,
sorts of names, and then kind of now with where we're headed with automation and with the
hmm
recent bank collapses and with the housing market being as wild as it is and so unaffordable, especially for millennials like myself and younger people.
Yeah,
um, these issues are creeping back up, and like the same, it's just like more examples of like, wow, Henry George said this about the vacant lot,
yep,
and here we have all this stuff in like Detroit and New York even. And so that's yeah, that's awesome that that got you started through your dissertation and your book. And I haven't had the pleasure of reading your book all the way through, but I have watched almost all of the presentations of yours that you've given, and yeah, you've really like touched on a lot of different key topics, and I've really enjoyed that. It's been really valuable to uh, see the dimension of Henry George beyond land value tax. Because I love land
right.
value tax, I'm very pro that policy,
hmm
but that's not gonna, especially for people who want to promote that idea, that's not going to be necessarily what is going to get most people really fired up, is this specific policy proposal. But the way he talked about inequality, like in the
Yep,
crime of poverty, and just it goes way beyond that. But yeah. So I kind of have like some other questions that I could ask. Like,
sure.
have you ever heard of William S. Uren? He's an Oregonian social reformer.
Yes, yeah, he's one of I can't remember any of the details, but the name is so distinct that I remember, towards the end of my book, I have a couple of pages actually of, all the people who at one point or another said, you know what turned me into a reformer, you know what turned me into a progressive, you know what turned me into a labor leader, was reading Progress and Poverty by Henry
Oh,
George. So that name stands out as one of the sort of the first generation of Georgists that really, or George influenced reformers.
yeah. I the reason I bring him up is being from Oregon, we have what's called the Oregon system, which is like the
Mhm.
initiative, referendum, and recall. And he
Yeah.
actually uh, popularized that secretly. Like he wanted the single tax, but he did the popular democracy route as like kind of a back door
hmm
to, although it's kind of the front door.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where I thought your book and your work really connected. And Uren was just one example of like kind of those. He loved single tax, but he was way beyond that.
hmm
And just, were there other people or that you think were particularly important that maybe people don't really connect, or
Me
with
too.
Henry George?
As George influenced people.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to, when you write a book, now it's eight years old, so I have to think about it. But even just people like Florence Kelly, who's a big social reformer, anti-child labor activist, social, settlement house worker. Jane Addams, another settlement house activist. Eugene Debs, the great labor leader and socialist candidate in the early 20th century. Those are just three that come to mind, but there's just just a long, long list of almost anybody that became. I think Francis Perkins, is another one who emerges as a classic kind of capital P progressive in the early 20th century. Certainly, those folks were either directly or indirectly, influenced by George. Again, the story is often the say somebody saying, when I was 17 years old, somebody handed me a copy of Progress and Poverty. Um, so it has and mostly, people took from it what they needed. So some people became single taxers, but a lot of other people just, the line I use in my book is most people, or not most people, but a really large number of percentage of George people influenced by George were taken by his diagnosis of America's ills, not so much his prescription to cure it, which was the single tax.
Sure.
So there's tremendous value in that, though, because he does have this way of saying, look, inequality is always, stalking advancing civilizations. And, as more complex a civilization becomes, the more wealthier it becomes, the more, advanced it becomes, inequality is just going to get worse and worse and worse, unless, that society is always watching out for it and doing things to make sure that it doesn't, get out of hand, and that the, very small percentage. He's one of the first people to use the term, the 1%. So, and then other, several other of his claims are, extremely important, which is essentially inequality unchecked. It will destroy democracy. You'll reach a certain point where democracy will simply be over. And when he was writing, he's saying democracy is kind of a shell of itself. Sure, everybody has the right to vote, but if you have the right to vote and you work 60 hours a week and you can't feed your family, you're not a free born citizen of the American Republic. You're a Russian serf. You're
Hmm.
some unfree person, um, unlike your father and your grandfather and people before you. And it's not your fault. You are being driven into that condition of inequality and poverty and hopelessness and lack of opportunity by economic forces that are made by laws and made by
Hmm.
policies. And we can fix that by changing those laws and those policies, if we only face up to it. So,
Yeah.
and that, when I tell students that or talk to people about that, they're like, "Yeah, inequality is destroying our democracy right in front of our eyes in 2023." And the power of monopoly power, billionaire power to influence and warp our democracy is happening right in front of our eyes. And George would recognize it immediately. He'd be kind of, obviously a person plucked out of a different century, but he would recognize the conditions pretty quickly as being exactly what he was talking about.
It's funny, I was watching a TikTok video that was kind of like, um, you when you see environmental degradation, and it had the Ohio train explosion, and
Yeah.
when you see wealth inequality and all these different things, it was really interesting because it was like, wow, it didn't, I think the person in mind just kind of had general social criticism in mind, but I was just thinking Henry George because that's
Mm.
the first person because of his focus on inequality and especially on monopoly and
Hmm.
yeah, I think that's something that a lot of Georgists maybe miss the in the modern era, or just it's kind of been forgotten. Is that he very much had a focus on uh, taming natural monopolies or things like the streetcars.
Yep.
I think it's Tom Johnson, the mayor of Cleveland, was
Yep.
really influential in like taming the streetcar
Yeah.
monopoly. It
Yeah.
sounds
Because,
funny to us.
but they had they were billionaire, or they were very wealthy corporations, and they were really big corporations, that ran the streetcar systems in big cities. So, that, and the water system, any of these public utilities, and nationally the telegraphs and the railroads were. George was not the only one that was saying we have to nationalize these things. These are,
Hmm.
they're indispensable to. We can't get rid of them. We need, in fact, they're doing wonderful things for us, but we need somebody, in the name of the people, needs to be in control of these things. And it's a very persuasive argument. I think it probably worked a lot more on the local level, like with Johnson, but it certainly was an argument where people very uncomfortable with state control of things, very uncomfortable of socialism and radicalism, could be kind of coaxed into that by a persuasive argument and good
Hmm.
examples. And George was just a master at that. He's quoting the Bible, he's writing. I mean, when he really, if you, the technical parts of the book where he's talking about rent and things like that are just like, oof, this is hard stuff to read. I have to read every line 3 times. But when he's just on a run talking about, the what how societies evolve and how inequality will undermine everything, and then it's irreversible. He uses the same kind of language that we do now about climate change. You'll reach a kind
Hmm.
of tipping point where you can't. The acceleration of climate change will reach a point where you can't even slow it down, let alone stop it. And he used the same imagery about inequalities. There's a certain point at which you can't wake up one day and say, finally, let's fix this. You may be too late. The republic
Hmm.
may be gone.
I mean, maybe we should be hopeful that we've made it this far, and
Hmm.
that there is some resilience to our institutions. But I do think that the last, I guess, 8 years, I don't know, 6 years, have been a
Yeah.
huge challenge for our institutions handling. not just it's economics which leads to the politics, but just the politics of it. I know in my lifetime, the rhetoric alone has gotten far more toxic, and it's surprising to think
Hmm.
about that. My first time I voted was the Obama McCain election,
Yep.
so there was a lot of hope and change rhetoric. It was much more we can do something about it, and now it's
Hmm.
much more doom and gloom from everyone.
Right. There's a lot of folks that think, can we just slow, can we have less terrible things happen, or can we have small terrible things happen on a smaller scale?
Yeah.
So but I mean, there is also hope in some of the things that have happened under Biden, where, some of the things. I mean, this is the other theme of Henry George, which is the common good, right? We've been at war with ourselves as Americans, from day one, actually, about individualism versus the common good. But we've also, most Americans appreciate both, and certainly the
Mhm.
founders believe we're not. I mean, we don't have enough time, but I mean, I could go on a long run about, libertarianism as this new fetish. Not new, but like it comes back every now and again, and now it
Mhm.
seems to be, a really point of fascination with people. And you just have to. I could say a lot of, but I would say one thing, which is that the founders were absolutely, positively not anything that could be characterized as libertarians. They believed in liberty, they believed in individual rights and all of that, and we should still believe in those things today. But they also believed in the common good, that we need to enact policies and do things that help the great majority of people, and we'll all be the better for it. And sure, we might have to fork over some taxes for it and all of that, but it's a small price to pay for clean water and educated populace and all of that. So that's another thing that, George really was pushing at, which pushing back on, which was this kind of this ideology of laissez-faire and unrestricted 100% individual rights to do anything one wants with one's property. Nobody can tell them what to do. So I think that's another direct connection to, the part of the problems that we face today.
Yeah. I think there's a quote from him where he says something about a professor even saying, like,
Mm,
a professor of today says, like, people just need to work harder or something
yeah.
along those lines, and just offer charity and everything will be okay. And it's like, yeah, honestly, like, it directly was like I thought of Ayn Rand
Yep.
immediately. I was like, he predicted her over 100 years or whatever before she ever existed. He was
Yeah.
thinking about her, what she was going to say, and it. I don't know if you have ever read Atlas Shrugged, but what's kind of interesting is
Mm,
uh, Galt's Gulch or Mulligan's Valley, which is where it takes place, is
mhm.
operated by a benevolent landlord, Mr. Mulligan or whatever. And so, like
Yeah.
Georges like to say, "Hey, you're missing a whole key point. Like, there's capitalists and there's workers, but
Right.
where's the landlord? Like, in her worldview, they're just absent. There's nothing."
Yeah.
And so I think maybe Henry George highlights today, like the people who receive with merely through ownership, no production. Like we're
Right.
seeing it like with patents, um, and just intellectual property in general is just very all over the place, hard to handle. Um, so yeah, I guess. What do you think of Henry George's other policies? Like, for example, the New York Times had an article from Professor Jill Lepore in 2011. There was an
Mhm.
article about his support of the secret ballot, and
Yes, that's right. That's another one of his. Yeah, the Australian
I
ballot, as they like to call
yeah.
it. Yeah.
What do you make of maybe George's other policies outside of LBT? Maybe they're ones we aren't familiar with or aren't brought up, or maybe they're too specific to the area or to the time. Um, are there any other besides secret ballot that he was a big proponent of from your research?
Yeah, I mean, the secret ballot is one of those things that, it's almost a tack on, right? You can see the connection, because nothing is gonna happen if, none of the things that George and Georges wanna see happen is going to happen if the political system is, in the hands of, people pulling all the levers in smoke-filled, rooms. And so the Australian ballot, which is basically Australia was, it's not the first place, but where they popularized private, secret voting, where you go behind a curtain and make your choices and all. Most Americans think that's the way we vote, but of course, back in the 1820s and 1830s, when everybody was getting the vote, you just went to meetings and raised your hand, or said it out loud, or when you walked up to a polling site, you literally said Jackson or Polk, or you said it out loud. So, and there was a certain virtue there that voting should be literally transparent. Everybody should know. But of course, late 19th century, you've got political machines that have poll watchers that will beat if they see that you haven't voted the right way, they will threaten you and beat you and make sure that you are made an example of. So people who are thinking of voting for the Labor Party or for the whatever party won't do it. So I think that there's a connection there, and he certainly was one of the people that kind of popularized it at that kind of tipping point in the 1890s, and it's pretty quickly adopted, starting in the mostly in the early 20th century, and now we wouldn't recognize voting. We wouldn't want it any other way. But it's one of those examples of like nothing. One of my many 11th commandments or I have 10 commandments of history. I think there are like 14 of them, but one of them is nothing has always been. Like everything has evolved and changed, and you don't have to go that far back to find that, oh, what we think of as always having been is, we didn't always, players didn't always stand on the sidelines of NFL games for the national anthem. They simply never did that until after 9/11, and then that becomes a point of contention, 20 years later. So anyway, it's an interesting thing. Trying to think if there's anything else specifically with George that we would point to, or he would show up in an encyclopedia article as a kid. I mean, and it's not it's a more negative thing, but it's also one we can unpack and understand, which is that in the 1870s, he's out there in California. He's a reform editor of several newspapers, and it's a Depression decade, huge economic collapse. And it's also California's caught up in this virulent anti-Chinese campaign, and people are pointing at the Chinese and scapegoating them for being very different, being non-European, being non-Christian, but also saying they are also putting Americans out of work. They work 20 hours a day. They can sustain themselves on rice and water. They're unnatural. They are literally, each individual Chinese person is a monopoly. Is undercutting Americans. And so the anti-Chinese movement is very virulent, very powerful in California. And California is the reason why we end up with the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's really lobbyists from California making that happen in 1882. And so you can go back to George's editorials in the 1870s and see he does say some pretty nasty, racist things about the Chinese. So we can't, let him off the hook by saying, oh, sure, everybody was doing it. But in his, it's not, if you are a reformer, you are trying to, diagnose social problems. And so for a lot of people, it seemed obvious in those days that the Chinese were somehow not fitting into our social, political, economic arrangements, and therefore they were a problem. So he was not alone. I mean, one scholar of the period, I think, said progressivism stopped the Chinese. Right? You could be very racially tolerant, believe in rights and citizenship for free, emancipated, enslaved people. You could believe in immigration and multiculturalism, but that you would stop at the Chinese to accept. That was sort of the outer limit for a lot of people, and he fell into that. However, after 1879, after 1880, he's on record. He doesn't necessarily embrace the Chinese, but he never goes off on a rant about the Chinese as being a major problem, and speaks in a much more in the language of tolerance and inclusion, to use our modern terms, than he had previously.
Sure. Oh, yeah, that's really interesting to hear that he kind of evolved a little bit, or maybe understood. My understanding, I've read some about this issue because I'm very interested in what Henry George had to say, but it sounds like there was also the potential, and I would definitely want your thought on this, that there was some angle about the Chinese laborers that were basically, they were almost, for lack of a better word, enslaved, or, almost indentured servants. And so some of it was, the pushback was like, wow, they're just like bringing in basically what are slaves now. and like
Yeah.
it's a new, and so we can't allow that. And then it was colored with a lot of racism and other arguments probably bleeding together. Is that true at all? Or
Yeah, I mean, that is part of the thing. So the monopoly accusation was also at that slightly higher level, macro level, saying many of these people are brought here by labor agents, unscrupulous, exploitive, overlords who secretly, because it's illegal, but
mhm,
secretly maintain control of these people, take half their wages, etc. So yeah, and
mm,
and they could be used as strike breakers, or at the very least
mm,
to show up in a mining camp or show up in a railroad site and either indirectly or directly be responsible for wages to be lowered. Where
mhm,
a hiring agent says, well, this crew's working, this group of 20 is willing to work for $1 a day, but this other group of 20 is willing to work for 92 cents a day. So I'm going with them, and what that group
yeah,
happens to be, the Chinese group. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of animosity on aimed at it from that sort of
sure.
perceived notion of monopoly as well.
Okay, that makes total sense. I guess it kind of also brings up another question that I have is that Henry George had a decent amount of influence on China through Sun Yat sen, and
Hmm.
then maybe through some other social reformers, and the connections are less strong. But like, there's a gentleman named Wolf Ladajinsky who was an American bureaucrat, essentially, who helped inspire land reform in Korea and Japan and Taiwan and China to an extent,
Hmm.
and like northern Vietnam, I guess, or South Vietnam. And so there, how is that possible? It seems like Henry George, if he was so very anti-Chinese for a long time, at least rhetorically, how
Yeah.
did that come to be? Maybe you don't have an opinion on that, but it seems like an oddity of history a little
Well, I think a lot of, by the time Sun Yat sen, who spent a lot of time in America, I don't know when he found George, but I'm guessing it was when he's living in New York,
bit. Yeah.
um, in the early 20th century, um, that he, that's where he probably found George. And so a lot of people, George begins in 1879. They know maybe a little bit of his backstory, but it's the publication of Progress and Poverty. That's the landmark book that grabs everybody's attention and is, to this very day available, still in publication, still available in multiple languages. So, and George was dead by then too. So
Hmm.
this is like I'm guessing for Sun Yat-sen, it was a book that's, he was interested in land reform and what would happen if the revolution in China actually succeeded. What would we do with this, feudal system? So he was probably casting about, and I think he read widely on questions of land and
Hmm.
reform and so forth. And someone, he must have come across Henry George's uh, Progress and Poverty and read it. I don't think he. So for him, I don't think he might have spent his entire life not ever knowing this
Yeah.
earlier chapter of George being on record as pretty anti-Chinese.
Okay, that makes total sense. That
Yeah.
makes total sense. Um, What do you think Henry George there were so one of the things that I feel like the Georgist movement has maybe been lacking on is a real engagement with the intricacies of race and land, and economics.
Hmm.
I think maybe in the past, maybe there were instances where it was better and worse, but, uh, there are some examples, like I think his name is Herbert Harrison, who was part of the Harlem. God, he has a name I can't remember, but he was
Yeah.
very influential in the early like civil rights movement. Like we're talking proto civil rights, I guess
Yeah.
maybe. But he was a socialist, and then he became a single taxer. But I guess this leads me to a broader question of what do you think Henry George's engagement was with other races, like African Americans? Um, I guess I don't know what the other example. Native Americans would be maybe another example that
Mm.
would be relevant, but I haven't heard anything about that. So that's kind of
Yeah. So I don't think he has. Certainly with Native Americans, probably doesn't have any relationship whatsoever. I mean, it's entirely possible. Many, by the 1880s, 1890s, there were notable Native Americans who came east to do lecture tours and talk about their plight and that sort of thing. And
mhm,
so Chief Joseph, was in the east quite a bit. So it's entirely possible that George would have met a Native American representative. To the extent, I'm pretty sure he doesn't use them as an example of land monopoly. Like once you lose
Hmm.
your land, you're toast.
Yeah.
And this is why when he's writing his book, in the 1870s, Ireland becomes one of his good examples, and then it connects with actual events on the ground. So the Irish Americans, Irish nationalists, are kind of in a land reform uprising in the early
Hmm.
1880s, and they turn to this guy Henry George, who's not Irish, he's not Catholic, but they say this guy, his ideas are spot on. Land for the people, and
Hmm.
that's his first sort of big audience. He didn't expect that at all. But for African Americans, he does cite, he says, look what happened if we emancipated 4 million enslaved people, and we didn't give them land, and now they are living in only a few notches above slavery, under the
Hmm.
thumb of the same people that once owned them. So if you don't have access to land, resources, an equal shot at these things, you are, you're subject to the whims of other people. You're not free. You're not a freeborn, fully independent, opportunity seeking, American citizen. And so I'm trying to think of other examples of. Frank Foster was a prominent labor leader in the Knights of Labor, African American, probably the most prominent figure in that period, and they became friendly. And I'm pretty sure Frank Foster introduces Henry George at the nominating convention. So in 1886, in his famous run for mayor of New York City, I think at that moment where they're about to nominate him, and this Labor Party, the most unlikely thing ever, really starts to take off. I think Frank Foster is the one who introduces Henry George. He definitely introduces him at some key moment, and I'm pretty sure it's then.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Was the audio just a little funky there, maybe? It kind of was being odd on my end, but I can hear you now totally
Well, I
fine.
was doing all the talking, so I don't know.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible. I mean, I'm right down here, 12 feet away from my router, so hopefully we've got decent
Yeah.
connection.
Cool. Cool. Yeah, no, it just like cut out a teeny bit when you were just
Yeah.
saying who uh Mr. Foster connected Henry George with.
Yeah, so Frank Foster was a labor leader, the most prominent African American probably in the Knights of Labor, and he befriends Henry George in this tumultuous 1880s. And I think Frank Foster is the one who introduces him at the great nominating convention in New
Okay.
York
Okay.
in October of 1886, when George is going to run for mayor of New York on the Labor Party ticket. So he does have
Gotcha.
African American, acquaintances, figures that he's rubbing elbows with. But
Hmm.
I would say, like a lot of people in his situation in that late 19th century period, his world is very much male, very much white.
Have you ever read any of Christopher England's work? He did a dissertation about the single tax movement, and then I think he just released a book based on his dissertation.
There is a new book out on Henry George. I've just become aware of it. I think it actually
Okay.
came out maybe like, in the fall, so it's not that long ago, but it's a 2022. So, but I haven't had all I know is I got an email just the other day saying, "Hey, would you please review this book for our,
Okay.
publication?" And then I think I might have seen that he was interviewed. I don't know if it's the same person, um, but on a history podcast. So
Okay.
it does seem that it was a long run there where there were no recent books on Henry George, and now mine in 2015 and this person's in 2022. So, and it's an academic publication, so I'm presuming it's probably a high quality publication.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is I think it's either it's a Georgetown or I can't remember. Maybe it's John Hopkins who's the publisher.
Yeah.
But yeah, it'd be like in the future, it'd be really good to hear your thoughts on the scholarly
Hmm.
level of the quality of the work, and because at least the dissertation is really interesting and like has a lot of it's awesome to mine it for citations and like
Yeah.
wow, random quotes and stuff like that. Uh, are so in your experience, are there any other scholars that are working on Henry George at now, or that we should try to look for? Um,
That's a good question. I don't know of any, but what a lot of times I don't know if anybody's working on, besides
sure.
this most recent publication, a full blown biography. But George just shows up everywhere. So
Yeah.
if you you could easily see, a book on the Knights of Labor that comes out that has, a full chapter on Henry George, or considerable, or a history of reform in New York City in the Gilded Age. And that's where you kind of see his comeback. He's had periods of comeback
Hmm.
in the past. In the 1930s, Great Depression, they reissue Progress and Poverty, and it doesn't become a bestseller, but they sell a lot of books. And
Hmm.
interestingly, the book that I used there's a sticky note on the inside from my dad that says, "This is your grandfather's copy, 1932 copy of Progress and Poverty." And my grandfather was an Irish immigrant with a sixth grade education, but very so much self taught,
Sure.
and so I was telling students the other day, I said, this gives you an idea. Like if my grandfather with a modest education was bought this book and almost certainly read it, it gives you an idea of that kind of the continuing engagement that people have with the book.
Sure.
So I think, circling back to your question, I think Henry George is definitely, if not directly, the object of study. Um, he is showing up in lots of studies that are relevant to the late 19th century, just because he's such a pivotal figure. Whether it's his ideas on economics, or connection to the labor movement, or the running for mayor in 1886, or his anti-Chinese statements, from the 1870s.
Sure.
He does tend to show up as a, I think if you run to the index of a there was a period where I was doing that all the time, where I was trying to get my book out, and every time I'd grab a new book and quickly go to the index, see how many George references, and just making sure that because when you're in kind of whenever you're working on a book, you're always afraid of getting scooped. You're
Hmm.
afraid that somebody's going to come out with one. You mentioned Jill Lepore, one of her many, the wide-ranging publications. She's kind of a wonder. Was a history of Wonder Woman. This cartoon,
Yeah.
character. And it turned out that a different scholar, had been working on a history of Wonder Woman for like 10 years. And her book came out, became a big bestseller. And then his book, was published like 6 months later. And he actually he was pretty, I guess, what are you going to do about it kind of attitude. And so I think he wrote an article, you can look it up. It's called, I Got Scooped by Jill Lepore. And, he's very fair minded. I mean, it's like, no, you don't own a topic. So,
Sure.
and I think he even says, I could have been a little faster in getting this thing out. So that is a concern. So anyway, my repeated, perpetual anxiety about somebody else putting out a book, pretty much directly on the topic that I was doing, did not materialize, thankfully.
Yeah. I guess, I'm thinking of another book. There was another one that just got released, but it's about Ireland, and it's like Henry George and the Irish land question, or I can't remember exactly.
Yeah.
I'll have to send you a link to both of them.
Yeah.
Just
I
for
mean, and that
your
would
ease.
be, like I have a chapter, kind of an example of the opposite, which is I have a chapter on Henry George and the Land League in Ireland, but that's definitely something that somebody could easily have written an entire book on, because
Hmm.
it's a big, robust moment in Ireland, and it's also connected to politics in the UK and in the United States. So, yeah, I'm not
Yeah,
surprised to see that.
kind of on to that. Since tomorrow's St. Patrick's Day,
Yes, indeed.
I'm personally Catholic, and you mentioned that you're Irish. Do what is Henry George? What was his relationship like with the Catholic Church and Catholics? Because I think there was maybe a bit of a difference.
Yes.
Just can you just kind of give us a broad examination of what that looked like?
Yeah. So George grew up in a Protestant, I would say small E evangelical family, pretty pious family. His dad sold
Hmm.
religious books. He was born in Philadelphia in 1839, so he grew up kind of steeped in religion, and going to church and Sunday school. Um, so he's fully, and he switches from, he becomes a Methodist. I can't remember his journey, but he switches around a little bit. But he basically stays pretty spiritual
Hmm.
and church going for much of his life. But he marries a woman named Annie Fox, who was Catholic, and I and so he, for most of his life, he's exposed to somebody who takes Catholicism seriously, and probably um, wouldn't accept any kind of negative, anti-Catholic statements. I mean, on the part of anybody, including her husband. Um, so George has exposure to Catholicism, and then of course he gets involved in the Land League, which is mostly a Catholic peasant uprising in Ireland, trying to, because 90% of Ireland is owned by a handful of families of English background. The great majority of people live as peasants, eking out a living and so forth. So he becomes quite sympathetic to Catholics and Catholicism, but he does, at a certain point, draw the ire of super conservative Orthodox Catholic clerics in the United States who are really anxious about the Knights of Labor, about socialism, about basically any kind of reform, women's rights, suffrage. They're saying this is all, dangerous, anti-establishment, anti-order thinking, and this is going to, we need to fight this. So the church's position, through much of the 19th century on any kind of reform issue or what we might call progress was no, no, no to democracy, no to science, no to women's suffrage, no to, labor unions and labor rights and so forth. So he does kind of have, and his book gets effectively put on the forbidden index in the Vatican, basically saying it's so dangerous, full of so many dangerous ideas that we need to let the word go out that Catholics in good standing cannot read this book. It probably, like a lot of these bans, it probably ended up selling more books than it did in terms of keeping it away from people. And one of his best friends, his followers, was a man named Father McGlynn, who was a pastor at a very poor parish in New York City, who, like a lot of people, somebody handed him a copy of Progress and Poverty, and he just said, the scales fell from my eyes, and I suddenly realized poverty is a man-made, manufactured condition. It's not natural, and everything I've ever been taught about just sort of living with it and dealing with it and trying to minimize it is false. And so he becomes a big Georgist, and so he becomes a rock star on the Georgist and the Land League, and then as a kind of a spokesperson. Whenever he spoke, he sort of said to Catholics, no matter what despite what the Vatican says about Henry George, if this Catholic cleric of great standing says he's cool, he's cool. So, but then George does have basically exchanges with Pope Leo in the 1890s, and the church, though, I'd have to get the date, dates worked out, but Rerum Novarum is the big encyclical that is big encyclical. I'm trying to think of a simple way of saying what it is, but like a proclamation of teaching.
Sure. Yeah.
Church issues these every now and again, and the church softened its position on labor unions and said labor unions are fine. They have to be under the, they have to be certain kinds, and they have to be subject to certain kinds of, influences. But so the church kind of, not necessarily through George, but through sort of observing what's happening all across industrializing Europe and in the United States, that they needed to kind of give a little bit on that front. And George was definitely part of that conversation.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Have you ever read about Father McGlynn's statement where he was excommunicated or whatever by the bishop at the time of New York, I guess, overseeing him. And then he wrote a little statement saying, this is the land philosophy. And I guess they said, you're back, you can come back now. But then he died like 3 months later or something.
It was so he gets excommunicated by Archbishop Corrigan, who's like the ultimate conservative cleric, fearful of any kind of radicalism and all, and just summarily excommunicates McGlynn, which has a real kind of really frightens, no doubt. We can't measure this as historians, but it certainly seemed to have put a chill on Catholic enthusiasm for George and the labor movement and all. And then he's McGlynn is sort of in exile for a while, but then slowly but surely over time, I think it's about a 2-year process, he is reinstated. So Corrigan loses, but then McGlynn moves him to I don't know what the upstate New York equivalent of Siberia is, but some tiny little town that is not, and he does die a couple years later. So, he's one of those interesting sub figures in that story of George's rise and, influence in the 1880s.
Was the role of the Anti-Poverty League in all of this, was that headed by Father McGlynn?
Yeah, he forms, he starts giving, sermons / lectures every Sunday night, and drawing huge crowds of people, including lots of non-Catholics, non-Christians
Hmm.
even. And yeah, so and then eventually founds this Anti-Poverty League, and it's basically a parallel organization to what George is doing. And they're basically, most of them are very enthusiastic single taxers or Georgists, because what's fired up McGlynn and what's animating his ideas about reform is George's principles and argument. And so McGlynn is helping sort of translate that to an audience, and gaining steam. And it basically takes those lines that George says, which I think I just sort of paraphrased a few minutes
Hmm.
ago, which is that poverty is not natural. I mean,
Hmm.
or mass poverty is not natural. Poverty is manufactured, whether it's unintentional or not. We manufacture it by our policies, by our tax policies, by our land use policies. But there's a whole long list of things. Today we throw in things like wages and insurance and all of that. So that is the Anti-Poverty League is with George McGlynn is saying, let's be part of this effort to sort of open people's eyes to see the artificiality and the fixability of poverty.
Hmm. This is kind of maybe an easier question. Do you think students should be required to learn about Henry George in any level of school? We'll just make it easy.
Well, I mean, I think one of the ways that you track, I never, did this scientifically with like a ruler, but if you were to look at 1980 U.S. history textbooks and then 1990 U.S. history textbooks in 2002, it seems to me like just my own anecdotal, reading of U.S. history textbooks, that George is getting more column inches, where he might get a sentence in
Hmm.
1970 or 1980. He's definitely, because we're sort of rethinking the Gilded Age in general and the labor movement. But I think George is definitely getting a lot more attention. I don't know if in say AP US history courses, how much, or like, because AP US history has a lot of primary source documents. I wouldn't be surprised if and they change them year after year, but I wouldn't be
Hmm.
surprised over the last 20 years that on a couple of years, a passage from Progress and Poverty has been one of the Gilded Age labor problem, um, document sets. I wouldn't be surprised at all. I don't know if I
Gotcha.
would say required reading, but I would say anybody who would consider themselves a well-read person on U.S. history should definitely know the essence of what Henry George stood for, in the same way that you would want to know, about Frederick Douglass, and if only one document, to read his July 4th oration,
Hmm.
in the 1850s, and Eugene Debs and um, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It's kind of the pillar figures that have not just shaped but reshaped our society over time. If there's, I almost said a Mount Rushmore, but like a Hall of Fame of people that have played an important role, beyond Martin Luther King and some of the ones that we immediately recognize. George is definitely in that, both for what he was doing in his lifetime, but also sort of that legacy thing, the kind of echoes of George decades on.
I do think I've seen some people kind of mention on TikTok, like, "Hey, I heard of Henry George in my AP history class," but it's
Hmm.
not very many people. Just like a couple, and I mean, I took AP history, so
Yep.
I definitely didn't learn about him there. I actually learned about him in debate, in high school debate. It was just
Okay.
like somebody had a random throwaway position. They were like, "We should do this land tax thing," and I had no idea whatsoever what it was or who he was. And then fast forward like 8 years, I learned about it more in college, like online.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, it just kind of grew from there. What are some of your favorite Henry George writings that are not Progress and Poverty? If you can remember back to reading
Mm.
through some of them.
Well, let's see. I mean, that is a bit of a tall order. I wouldn't remember specifically, but the other book that he publishes in that period. So, Progress and Poverty comes out in 1879. In 1883, I think, he's by then he's written a bunch of big essays for publications that are sort of the equivalent of the Atlantic Monthly um,
Okay.
today. The Century magazine, and can't remember North American Review. I can't remember which one he published in. In fact, this relates to his reference to the professor who he had this very, that he's speaking directly about William Sumner, who was the professor at Yale, who was America's foremost social Darwinist, who was just saying, forget the poor. they're poor because they're losers, they're drunkards, their job is to die and make society better. And, so that's who he's referring to. And in these about 12, 14 essays that he wrote, he couples them together in this book called Social Problems. And it's a great book to read because it's some of it's very topical. Like some of them are on immigration, or mostly on immigration, and mostly so you can kind of see George deepening. Now it's 4 years on from his first book. He's deepening his thinking and talking about different things more and more in depth, sort of applying Georgism to all kinds of other issues that he didn't get to in the book. So I would say, picking up a copy of Social Problems, again, also still in print, is probably a good place to start. The other one, if you want to go way back to the origin story, the Overland Monthly, I think that was the publication, published. So when he's out in California and the Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869, it really doesn't start to really be seen until the early 1870s. He writes this incredible essay called "What the Railroad Will Bring," and it's progress and poverty in seed form. He doesn't even know this, but he basically says, "Look, the railroad is," and we have to remind ourselves in the 21st century, the railroad was like the space shuttle. It was, or the super collider. It was the most astounding, transformative technology. It's not a choo-choo that your grandma takes you to, at the old historic park when it choo-choos around. No, this is a transformative machine. And so George is saying, look, this incredible new thing is going to open up California to the world. It's going to lead to all kinds of development and all kinds of people and economic growth, et cetera, comma. However, it's also going to bring inequality and the rise of a moneyed class, et cetera, et cetera. So he's on to this problem of progress, which he said, wouldn't you think that progress would mean that everybody does better? Maybe not the same amount, but that we'd progress to a higher level of society. And here we are in the Gilded Age where we're progressing in categories like economic growth and wealth creation and industry and technology, but we see more poverty. Why is this so? Well, he's onto that problem way back in, I don't know, it's 1871, 72, something like that. You can find it pretty easily. It's What the Railroad Will Bring, Overland Monthly, Henry George. I'm sure there's a copy of it somewhere, or a digital version of it somewhere.
Yeah, that's good. I'll try to post all the things that you mentioned in the description of the video down here below. And
okay.
Yeah, that's really good information because I've had other people recommend different things, and there's some things like it's kind of funny you mentioned Progress and Poverty. The original is like 600 or some pages, and it's like, I think
my
copy's
my copy's 543. I think for some reason that number is in my head.
Yeah, maybe that's exact. But like it's only at the end that you're like, wow, that is compelling writing. At first, this is like every chapter is like difficult to slog through, but you're like that final one where he kind of describes what could happen and all the is just really compelling.
Yep. I've chapter 2 of my book is basically a slow examination of book by book. It's books and then chapters within books. And I've had so many people say to me, God, he said, how did you end up, I think it took me 6 months to write that chapter because I had to read, every word and, it's old economics history. So I'm like, I know I have like a passing knowledge of David Ricardo, and I certainly know Malthus, but like, what is he talking about here? And so it took me a while to figure that out. But that one sort of 30-page dive into the book it doesn't tell you everything. So I won't tell you that's your shortcut, but it is kind of a cliff note indication of the general main points of each of the 10 books in his overall book.
What would you say Henry George's legacy is? What can we learn maybe from it today the most, or that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, his whole his idea, what got him going was he said economics as a profession is totally off base. We are listening to people that don't know what they're talking about, or they are willfully misleading us, speaking on behalf of vested interests. And so a lot of his goal was to write this Progress and Poverty book and kind of blow economics out of the water. And, in some ways, maybe he envisioned that he'd become, the chair of economics at a kind of a new economics department. He was kind of felt stiffed by the academy. So questioning economic dogma, there's a new book I just saw come out, uh, explaining the big myth, debunking the big myth, something big myth. And the subtitle is, how business got us to hate government and love the free market. And, that's a 50, you could pick a different, you could say mid 70s at University of Chicago economics school becomes very influential. And that's really, Milton Friedman, and the free market is free market is not only is a great thing, it's a natural thing. Like, this idea that it's self-evident and that government is bad, and the smaller the government, the better, lower the taxes, the better. And that all really from, 1980 up to the present day, well, up to say 2008, those ideas, you would ask a auto mechanic who hasn't really thought a whole lot about economics, and they'd say, oh yeah, unions are terrible. Minimum wage is bad. Government is bad. I want, lowest possible taxes because it's all being wasted. And like, how does that guy learn that? Right. That's a project that vested economic interests have been in hundreds of different ways, creating think tanks, endowing chairs at universities, writing books, et cetera, influencing people, so that the average American's kind of default position is, yeah, I don't really like unions, really not big on unions. And I'm not really big on, minimum wage. I'm not really big on, I want my taxes to be absolutely low. I also want my public schools to be the absolutely very best. I want my streets plowed. I want parks, there's a Southside Johnny song that is always in my head, which is I don't know if it's the title of the song or it's the refrain, which is all I want is everything. And this is a book I'm going to write someday, or maybe in my head anyway, which is like, as Americans, all we want is everything. What's wrong with that, right? We want zero taxes and the best public services, public schools, parks, street lights that work. We want all of that, And so, anyway, back to your question. One thing that George, the one sort of main takeaway from George is to say, challenge economic, leading economic theory, that says that you clearly can see favors those who have, those with advantage, those in positions of power, those who don't know anybody who's ever been on unemployment or has ever been evicted from an apartment. Those, challenge that. So those economic dogmas are different from the late 19th century, but they're not that different. And we have imbibed, and it's seeped into our political culture over the last 50 years to be seemingly self-evident. And suddenly now you're starting to see, particularly among young people, those conservatives freak out when they say that, 77% of, millennials and younger have a favorable view of socialism. Well, yeah, because they're seeing it as a corrective to what they now can see right in front of their face, which is a system that is not designed, or it is designed to favor the smallest number of people possible, and is punishingly cruel to lots of people. And so, socialism may not be the answer, but something trending, something socialistic-ish, which is what Henry George's ideas were sort of in that sort of vaguely socialist category. Same like Eugene Debs. He wasn't really a true blue European socialist. He's more of a Georgist in that regard. And so I think there's a lot more attention being paid to taking a fresher look at our economic dogmas and seeing whose interest they serve. And, why don't we leave that? That's a good, hopeful note to leave it on.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That was really a good point. Yeah, that's a really good way to end it. And I really, again, I appreciate your time and want to thank you again for the bottom of my heart that you even spoke to me. You're the first person. I do plan on trying to reach out to more professors and more thinkers like yourself that are of your high caliber of work. And it'd be maybe one day we could get like a panel or something and do something cool, or like have a chat with even more people, but way in the future. So,
all right. Well, that sounds good. And, I'm very much present on all forms of social media, but I've never actually done a live chat before in any of these platforms. So I enjoyed this thoroughly, but also enjoyed the opportunity to have my first crack at doing one of these live things. So it was incredibly, technologically speaking, quite easy. You made it easy. I popped it in and there we were.
Good. I'm glad that it was YouTube made it easy for us. So I appreciate it and happy to provide that opportunity. And I really, again, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. It's good to hear from an expert who has been very credentialed and is as influential as you are. I love your Weemsy awards and things like that. I watch your content a lot, so I think it's all great. So
well, we should give, if I may give a plug to anybody who's listening, you know, all my social media is the same thing. It's at In the Past Lane with a P. So INTHEPASTLANE. You can find me on TikTok and YouTube and Twitter and all that stuff. So yeah, cool. You can check out all the things.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And thank you again for your time. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and have a happy St. Patrick's Day tomorrow.
Indeed. All right. I'm actually bolting out to a pre-St. Patrick's Day event just down the street from me. So.
Oh, awesome. That's good to hear.
All right, great. Well,